Hello, everyone. Welcome. On behalf of the Southeast MHTTC, just want to welcome you all to today's event with Dr. Wofford again. It's part 2 of our ACT series. And today we're going to be focusing on intentional commitment to behavior change, values, and committed action. Just turn it right over to Dr. Wofford to launch into the content. Dr. Wofford, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be here again. Just as a quick intro for folks who maybe weren't able to be here a couple of weeks ago, I'm a licensed clinical psychologist in Atlanta, Georgia, and use ACT as my primary orientation in my outpatient therapy practice. My primary population of service are individuals living with schizophrenia spectrum disorders and bipolar disorders. And ACT, I wouldn't say exclusively, because I still feel pretty integrative in my approach, but it is sort of the foundation of how I approach all the work that I do with the populations that I serve. And so today I'm going to be talking to you a bit more specifically as we get into the 6 processes related to ACT. I'll do a brief overview at the start today, and then we'll really dive in because I'd like to do some experiential practice today. So acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT for short, is one of our third wave psychotherapies. So along with DBT and other therapies that are focused primarily on areas of acceptance, mindfulness-based practice, and compassion-oriented approaches. It has a lot of similarities of other therapies. Stephen Hayes, who developed ACT, has said in a past training that if CBT and DBT had a kid, it would look like ACT. And I know there's been a lot of questions about some of the major differences between ACT and DBT, since there is a lot of overlap. I think what you'll find for folks who practice DBT and are thinking about ACT is there are a lot of processes that are similar, a lot of ideas that are similar, but ACT will show itself to be much more experiential in the strategies that are used in session with a client. So there are a number of activities very similar to DBT, but DBT can be more sort of educative, where ACT is much more experiential. That's a gross oversimplification, but that's probably one of the main differences. And if you were to start practicing ACT, you would probably notice that the way you engage with different processes or different ideas is much more experiential than the more sort of procedural activities that can come with DBT. Of course, that's not exclusive. We all practice in different ways depending on our style, but that's probably the biggest, I would say, foundational difference. ACT is an evidence-based practice, and it has robust support for a number of different diagnoses, and you'll find everything from psychosis to depression oriented experiences, anxiety disorders. It has a lot of similarities with exposure and response prevention, but it can be used for OCD. There's a lot of very similar principles. So pretty much across the board, it's got evidence base. It's also been shown to have evidence for different populations, teens, couples, and in different settings. So in inpatient settings, in group settings, and of course in individual therapy. So if you're wondering if this is something that you want to dip your toe into, you should be able to pretty quickly in the literature find support for perhaps whatever population that you might be serving. I certainly didn't give you an exhaustive list, just the ones that came to mind. And I'll share at the end some resources, but one of the best places to get more information about ACT is the Association for Contextual and Behavioral Science, or ACBS, and that's kind of the international community for ACT practitioners. And on there are resources and listservs and special interest groups for a number of different populations. So we're going to start last week or 2 weeks ago, I gave kind of an overview of ACT. And these next 3 weeks, we're going to dive into the 6 processes. And the 6 processes are actually divided into 3 different domains. The first is doing what matters, and that includes values-based living and committed action. So today we're going to describe those 2 processes, values and committed action, and talk about different strategies that can be used. I'm going to give you examples of strategies that you can take away today, and then we're actually going to practice some in our time together. I really want to prioritize that. Please let me know if you have questions, drop them in the chat and Stephanie will let me know. And yeah, I'm happy to talk along as we address those questions as we move along, and definitely want to prioritize some experiential practice. This is the ACT hexaflex, and the overarching goal in ACT is psychological flexibility, which is essentially the idea of opening up as many routes to get to where you want to go. Oftentimes, we or our clients come to us because they're stuck trying to make one path work, either because it's worked in the past, or it seems the most obvious, or it's the most comfortable. But they're finding that this path is not working for this situation. So our overarching goal in ACT is to invite people in a variety of different ways to open up to different routes of getting to whatever that end goal is, or that valued experience might be. This is the hexaflex, which is sort of the schematic for ACT. And what's great about ACT is it in and of itself is flexible, meaning you can start anywhere that you want with a new client or from session to session. And the more familiar you get with the processes, the more you'll notice that you're actually able to do a number of different processes in the same session. They're very complementary, they're very integrated with one another, and the more you practice, you'll feel like you're moving pretty fluidly between them. I personally like to start with values and committed action. Those other two domains that I mentioned are open up, which include acceptance and diffusion, and being present, which includes contact with the present moment and self as context. I like to start with values and committed action because in any kind of therapy, and I think really specifically in ACT, we're going to be inviting people to do things that are pretty uncomfortable. They're new, they are unfamiliar, there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think it's helpful for people to be able to answer for themselves, why am I going to do what Rachel or Dr. Wofford is inviting me to do? Why would I do this role play that she's inviting me to do? Why would I do some of these activities outside of session that she's asking me to try? Why would I engage in my thoughts and relate to them differently, or relate to my emotions differently when I've been doing it one way for so long? So I think framing our work in, let's think about the life that you want and how it's different than the life that you have now. And I think once we're able to do that, it can really increase motivation to try things that are inherently new and uncomfortable. And especially if we're able to link it directly. Here's what I'm inviting you to try. Here's why I think it would be helpful. And here's how I think it relates to that early conversation we had about what you said you wanted your life to look like and how you want to experience your life. And because values and committed action go so well together, they just sort of naturally fall in line. So that's personally why I start there. Another reason I'll say that I start with values is with the particular population that I am working with. So folks who are living with psychosis or bipolar disorder, a lot of the conversations are about symptoms and are about maintaining symptoms, managing symptoms. What are your symptoms like? What is your medication? Are you taking it? And I found early on in my work with ACT that they weren't being asked a lot about, well, what about your life outside of these experiences? And I think that's so important, to start to paint a picture and really facilitate the narrative for someone that recovery is something that I believe in for you. I don't know what it's going to look like or how we're going to get there, but I absolutely believe it's a possibility. And I think that is just as important, if not more so, than the symptoms that you're having, how intense they are, how frequent they are, especially because we may not always be able to predict or control those experiences. And I'd like you to feel like you can engage with a meaningful life regardless of the experiences or the symptoms that you're having. So that's my rationale for starting with values today in this session, is because that's how I start with all of my new clients for the most part, with some very minor exceptions. So for each of the next few sessions, I will be breaking these domains down in more detail, and each of the processes down in more detail. So today I've got them here for you just for reference, but we are going to just focus on the do what matters side. And so here are some of those questions that we might be thinking about kind of conceptually for our clients and wondering about their values, and perhaps some kind of long-term therapy goals that we might be thinking about. Is our client able to be clear and connected with their values? Are they able to take and sustain values-guided action? And are they able to set goals and have sufficient skills to achieve those goals? So those are some of the things that we're kind of thinking about. I'm going to break these apart a little bit and talk about values separately, and then talk about committed action separately. And knowing that, again, these are very complementary, they're very integrated, and I think you'll see that as we do some practice with each of them. And again, if you have questions as I'm going along, feel free to drop them in the chat. So I'm throwing around this term values. So what is values, or what are values, or what is values-based living? Values is the process of clarifying who you want to be and how you want to move through this life. Very simple statement, but a pretty complex process if you think about it. If you just sit with yourself for a minute and ask yourself that question, like, who do I want to be? How do I want to move through this life? That how and that who are really interesting ways of thinking about ourselves and how and our kind of place in the world. And it can be really important if we're looking for some sort of guidance or roadmap for how to navigate different situations. So the process of values is helping someone clarify who do they want to be, what do they want to embody, and how do they want to move through challenges, successes, relationships. What are the values or experiences or characteristics that they want to embody as they're doing that? And that can be a really important anchor for someone. If you're going through different situations and you're wondering, how am I supposed to handle this? I'm getting pulled, I'm getting a lot of feedback, what I'm supposed to do. There's a lot of shoulds there. To have a sense of who you are and who you want to be can be, and really clarifying those can really be helpful in helping someone guide themselves through challenging situations. We're also going to be helping people move toward those experiences in an ongoing way, and that are important now and that they imagine want to influence the future. Another great thing about values is that's something someone can start on day one, because it's not something you have to work up toward. Once we help someone identify values, that day we can identify a step that someone can take to be that version of themselves. Even if they're not sure they fully buy in, even if they're not sure how it's going to fit for them, even if it feels a little like clunky and uncomfortable, it is something we can identify a step toward that moment. So it provides also early experiences of accomplishment. So for example, and we're going to walk through some values exercises, but let's say someone identifies honesty as a value, or kindness through one of the strategies that we do together. That day before someone leaves, we can say, what is something you could do today that would feel like an act of kindness? That if you did that, you would feel like, I have embodied kindness today. And most people can think of something. And even if they can't, they can probably engage with us around an idea, opening the door for someone, giving a compliment, sending a text that says, I love you. So really looking for sort of low-hanging fruit so that someone gets some accomplishments really early on and is able to see, already today, I'm doing something that's connected to the person that I want to be and the way that I want to move through this world. There are some common challenges, and this common challenges section is sort of what we would notice about someone, how we might notice that someone is not connected to values. Because people can come into therapy being very clear about their values and noticing that there is a disconnect maybe between what their values are and how they're living, or maybe values isn't even the issue. Across on that hexaflex, people can get stuck at any one of those 6 processes, but it doesn't have to be all of them. So someone may come in with very clear values, and that may not be part of your early work, might just be like identifying those, making sure we understand as the clinician what those are, so we have that language, and then moving on to another process that is perhaps more in need for someone. Reviewing values, even if someone is already connected, is also a nice entry point for early sense of accomplishment. But here are some of the ways that we might know that someone is not very connected to their values, that they are unsure who they are, or how they want to be in the world or why they do things. And it might come from specific inquiries that you have, or it might just come up in conversation, something that you kind of notice through the different ways that you're talking about things. I shared an exercise 2 weeks ago that can be used as part of an intake or in one of the early sessions that helps someone start to clarify what the problem is that they're experiencing, the areas that it disrupts, and the places that they get stuck. That second part, the areas that it disrupts, is kind of an early nod to values. So you might get some of that information early on, or you might decide to, it might come from some more formal processes or conversations. But unclear values, being able to talk about the current activities that they do or the way they spend their time, but also being able to say, this doesn't really feel important to me. It doesn't really feel meaningful to me. And you notice a gap between where the effort is going and how reinforcing or helpful it seems to be. And a conversation when I'm introducing values with someone is thinking about the values and then having a conversation, or even have some exercises. I don't have them here actually, but it's a pretty simple exercise. Just ask them to identify, where do you think you are in relation to this? Like on a scale of 1 to 10, we've identified some values in an exercise. How close are you to these different values? And the larger the gap between where someone wants to be, how they want to experience the world, and how they're spending their time, the more distress. No matter what the maybe diagnosis is, whether it's psychosis, whether it's mania, whether it's depression, whether it's difficult challenges with eating or disordered eating, whatever that, the larger the gap is between how they're spending their time and who they want to be, the more distress that we will see. And I'll share that explicitly with folks. And a lot of people can really relate to that. Another place we might see values is when someone's going through a transition, or not connected to values, is when someone is going through a transition, maybe in their roles or in relationships, where the previous values they were operating on just no longer seem, they're not really connected to them anymore. They're not providing what they used to provide. So maybe parents who have kids that are grown up and that role has changed and their values were around being a parent and care-based living or caring for someone else, or working to provide. And now that shifts. That can be, I'm sure we've all had clients who've made that decision, that transition, and there's this kind of a lost feeling. So there might be time for new values, or a relationship ends and there'd been something about values related to that relationship, healthy or not, that now shift when that relationship changes, whether with a partner or a family member, whatever it might be. And so these are ways that we might start to notice that someone is feeling disconnected from a values kind of guided life. And there are lots of different ways to approach values. And so I've given you a list here. This is certainly not exhaustive. If you have an ACT text, or if you want to poke through some of the resources I provide at the end or in the previous workshop, there's going to be a number of different ACT strategies that you can use, but they're all helping someone think about themselves in a little bit of a different way. Who do I want to be? And how do I want to experience myself in the world? So I'm actually going to walk through most of these, and then we're going to actually work on one together. As I mentioned at the beginning, one of the fundamental differences between ACT and maybe some other therapies, specifically DBT, is that it's very experiential. So I'm not explaining values to people until after we do an activity. I might say, like, seems like what you're doing and how you're spending your time isn't feeling very meaningful to you. Or I'd like to learn about what matters to you. Would you be open to doing an exercise? And that's really the only kind of preparation that I do. And I think that's important so that people really get the full experience. And then afterwards, we can kind of break it down and debrief. So here's and I'll say I use all of these and have used them in different ways. And so you can, depending on your relationship with the client or what you think would work better, you can try all of these out. The 80th birthday prompt is a fun one, where you're asking someone to imagine their 80th birthday party and all the people that they care about, people they already know, and maybe people they haven't even met yet, are at this party. And what everyone's decided to do at this party is stand up and say how you've lived your life. How has your client lived their life? You're asking them to imagine this. And then you ask them, what do you hope they're going to say about how you spent your time on this planet or during this life? What do you hope they will say about how you engaged in the world? And then you just see what happens. One of the, I think, components of ACT that's really useful with no matter what the process is it's a lot of just an invitation to think about something or experience something without any attachment to an outcome. So for me, there's no right answer to any of these questions. Whatever someone says, even if it's like out of left field or not at all what I was expecting they would say, or maybe even indicates they didn't really understand the exercise, whatever they say is useful. And it's an entry point into looking further. Do they understand meaning? Is that, and what it means to have a meaningful life? And if not, does that say something about their early experiences and what narratives they might have around what life is supposed to look like? So you just kind of open it up and see what comes of it. You can do this aloud, you can do this with writing, whatever someone feels comfortable with. I also really like the documentary film prompt. And you can do this in a few different ways, especially depending on things that you're like examples that your client may have given before. So sometimes it's like 60 minutes or 2020 or this documentary film idea, or it could be a social media reference. But the idea is that you're asking someone to imagine their life in sort of an isolated time point. So maybe like over the last week since I've seen you last, or just the last 7 days. Suppose a camera crew wanted to do a profile on you or your family. When, with your permission, they followed you around for a week, filmed everything that you did. And then suppose they came back in a year and did that. And I might break this up and just do the first part and then do the kind of return or the sequel. But I might ask, what do you think would happen? What would they see in that documentary film? What are the things that would show up? What would, if I were watching that, what would I see in that documentary? And what would the title be? And then I'll ask the follow-up, which is, all right, imagine they came back. They really wanted to see, like, what does life look like for you, for this person? And we want to see where you are now and the way that they do in these kind of profiles. What do you hope they will see in that 1 year? And what would the title of that be? And again, it's not a direct question of like, what are your values, but it gives you a sense, or someone a sense, to imagine themselves in a different way, imagine themselves moving through the world in a different way. For those who have some familiarity with ACT, you might notice that this sounds like a little bit like it's requiring what we would call the observer self, that ability to kind of like step outside yourself and watch what you're doing or watch what's happening in your life. That's a self as context process that we'll get to in one of the later sessions, but you can already see how there's a relationship between how these different processes work. And someone might have difficulty sort of stepping outside themselves. And so if they even have struggle with this kind of exercise, that would even be really helpful information to try to understand. As I said, I'm just going to share some other examples. This is the bullseye exercise, and all of these are freely available. I've shared the links here. They're all freely available online, so I'm not giving you anything that wouldn't be able to otherwise access. And these are just prompt ways that you can ask people to think about domains. You can think about ACT as sort of your values across domains, but some people do think about values that are really specific to, here's how I am at work. And it's really important that these values are relevant to work. And they actually might look different than how I am at home. And so this can provide that space to kind of clarify those. And then people can actually look at or identify, where am I in relation to my values? And so it gives a nice visual to that gap that I mentioned earlier, and to notice if there are some places that actually are working pretty well. I feel really connected, but here's the place where I'm not feeling so connected. And that can help us identify where to spend some time. And again, all of these are just sort of invitations without any expectation about what someone's going to write down. Some people write down goals in this, like they're very action-oriented steps. And that can be a helpful conversation then around values. What are values and what are the differences between goals? Another one, if your client is up for it, is the tombstone exercise. It's similar to the 80th birthday in a way. It's sort of thinking about yourself sometime in the future and reflecting on how you would want to do this life. But it can be a really powerful exercise for people who feel comfortable doing it, is to think about the different ways that someone can think about the difference between here's what I want to avoid, here's what I don't want to experience, and then here's what it would look like to write down what a meaningful experience would be, and to kind of be able to compare those in a really curious way. I'm sorry, I just saw a question in the chat. I can pause here and take a look at it. Someone mentioned that they're curious about how to navigate values conflicts, especially when one value might take away from living in another. That's a really good question. I think generally speaking, an ACT approach to something like that, and it might bump up, this might come up again in a number of different ways, is ACT is very much a both and multiple truths approach, which is let's think about why these values are maybe not working together. How do we know that they're not working together? How do we know that they're bumping up against each other? What tells you that? And is there a way to make space for both of them, even if it means you have to sit with some uncertainty and some multiple truths about yourself? Like, this over here feels meaningful to me. This over here also feels meaningful to me, although they seem like they would not be friends. But that's another way to really promote flexibility is there a way for these things to coexist that we haven't thought about before? And we might have to open up to seeing ourselves in different ways, or sitting in uncertainty when we have things that feel like they wouldn't normally go together. But that's the initial way that we would talk about it. And it's, excuse me, not uncommon that people might initially identify values in a values exercise. And then over time, we realize, I wonder if this is a value for you, because you identified it over here, but it doesn't really seem like when you engage with those activities that you are feeling like they're meaningful. And meaningful doesn't always mean comfortable, doesn't always mean easy, it doesn't always mean joyful, it just means like that was meaningful. Like honesty is a value, and that's not always comfortable to share, to be honest, and to really share what's on your mind, to be assertive, to advocate for yourself, or to tell someone something that's hard to hear, but you're doing it because you care about them. So there's lots of different ways we can make space for exploring and being curious. That, ACT is rarely ever is forcing us to choose between something and something else. It's usually an invitation to see, is something working? Can it work? Is it possible? And if not, is there a way that I can relate differently or adjust to allow space? So that's a kind of a broad answer, but that's, ACT is really about broader ideas that you can kind of apply across different contexts. So I hope that's helpful. Another one that people may be familiar with, getting back to exercises, is the values card sort. This is just a screenshot, but you can print this off, you can cut them, all the different cards, and then you ask people to organize their values into important, very important, and not important. And then you keep asking them to filter through all the cards until they get down to a certain number, like 3. So they go through it multiple times. This one can take a while, but again, depending on your client and what you think they might be interested in, this can be an interesting exercise to think about, because it really asks you to like manipulate. You have to, holding the cards in your hand also has a really helpful experience with it. This is the values checklist. This is, if you look up values checklist, this is probably going to be the most standard one. And I did use this one for a long time, and I do like it for a number of reasons. But sometimes the definitions can get a little clunky, and for some people, the definitions don't always resonate. It's also a lot of things to think about. But it can be useful for folks who want to read and think, and you kind of you kind of label them on very important, quite important, and not important, I think. And then eventually you hone it down to like 6, the top 6. So for all of these, it's sort of letting people go through a first pass, what matters to you, and then ultimately narrow it down. And the one I want us to work on together today also does that. And it's recognizing that we all have a lot of values. We all have a lot of things that we care about. Values often can be very similar to each other, and not everything has an equal level of importance. There's never a hard number of values, like you can only choose 6 forever and always. But it does help us recognize that I like to, the metaphor I kind of offer is like values are like the studs of a house. You can repaint the outside, you can add, you can do renovations, you can add additions to and rooms to a house, but the studs, that sort of the main studs are probably going to remain. And that's how you might think about yourself. There are probably things about yourself that you just care about in terms of the person that you want to be, whether you're at work, whether you're a mom, whether you're, a parent or a partner. They're probably going to have at least some that overlap across domains. Like, this is just what I care about and how I want to be experienced by other people and how I want to experience the world. So in order to really drive this home, I want to take about 5 minutes to do an exercise together. And I'll offer, for those who weren't here a couple weeks ago, that ACT is very experiential, as I've stated, but also when we're thinking about ACT consultation groups, like if you were to be in an ACT consultation group, we are practicing with our own stuff. It gives us the idea of understanding what it's like for a client and also to really feel the process work on us. So I'm going to invite all of you to do that today. Hopefully you can see this. And just I'll time us to take 5 minutes. And if you can kind of imagine that you go through, I know it's probably hard to do online, but maybe go through and start to either mentally in your mind kind of cross out the ones that you know are not important, keep the ones that initially feel important, and kind of keep doing a pass until you end up with, the top 3 is what this exercise offers you. Again, I know it's a little bit more difficult to do online, but you can jot down the ones that really stick out to you, or there might be 3 that you can really latch onto at the beginning. But just take 5 minutes. Now I'll do 4 minutes, and I'll stop talking to just kind of walk through this exercise together. And then at 4 minutes, I'm going to invite you to do one more step. As a reminder, if you can, do this for yourself and not a client. Like, really think about how you would answer this, or like a couple minutes left. And if you don't get it finished, you can always go back. You'll be getting access to these slides. Another minute or so. Okay. If you didn't make it all the way through, that's okay. You can finish it later. If you did, or if you are close and have at least identified one or two that you know would be in that final three, there's a second offering or invitation for you at the top, which is in the space below, or and you're writing it down in front of you. Write down a goal or a step or an action that would bring one of these values to life over the next week. What I like about this example is I think the values are facilitate more connection with that action-oriented approach. So it's a little bit easier to imagine an action, I think. And so this enhances that connection with committed action. It kind of starts to already bridge that gap right at the values conversation. I'll give this to someone, I'll send them home with it at the end of a session. Sometimes we'll do it in session together. Either they forgot to do it on their own, or it just feels like a nice time to sit together and allow someone to take the time. You might realize that for some of you, you were able to do it quickly, and some of you might realize, I need more time. I need to sit with this. And you might notice that things were coming up for you around like, oh, I should pick this. But I'm noticing that there's a little bit of dissonance, or there's something about it that feels like a should. And so feel free to, if it, feels comfortable, maybe write in the chat just what any initial impressions were for you doing this exercise. If there's anything you noticed about doing this exercise that you feel comfortable sharing, taking on that experiential role. And yeah, we'd just love to hear if anybody feels comfortable sharing, what that was like to think about your own values and think about really shining that light down on who you want to be and how you want to move through this world, what you want to embody. Any brave souls who feel comfortable sharing? I know for me, it's always a much more challenging exercise than I imagine it to be. And it really does help clarify, like, here's really how I want to be spending my time. This is what brings me joy. Yeah, so I think there's a variation in some people are very connected to their values. And so it can be pretty easy and straightforward. And for some, it is a bit more of an exploration, or at the very least, just a curious exercise, even if you end up with those three that you thought you'd end up with from the beginning. That's a great point that someone made, is that a lot of the values go together in different ways, but you can almost imagine like, well, this one actually embodies this one. Like if I'm doing this one or I'm engaging with this value, then I feel like this one inherently comes with it. So this one is really the more salient value for me, and then it includes some other experiences. I think that's a really important point, and that's a clarifying thing that we can talk through with clients too, and that it's okay. So and we don't feel the need to, if someone picks like 3 versions of the same thing, that's okay. We then might bookmark that, and as someone moves through therapy, we might be able to highlight for them, this is something that keeps coming up, and I wonder if that would be a value that we want to add to that list that we made before. So we're never about correcting someone's values or saying, well, this doesn't seem like it goes with you. It's really an open invitation, and then we can always invite someone to consider if there is ever a value that didn't seem like it was as obvious to them. So thank you guys for sharing your experiences. So then you can imagine how this is sort of a natural movement into committed action. Hopefully all of those exercises or you saw some opportunity for that in all of the exercises that we looked at. Because once someone identifies how they want to move through the world, who they want to be, the next question is, okay, well, what do I do to make that happen? What are the actual steps to be that person, to do that have that meaningful experience? And this is that committed action piece. And the processes for committed action are linking steps that move toward values. And what are those concrete behavioral changes that we can put into exercises and very clear steps to achieve them? A way that I might introduce the relationship between values and committed action, or I might say, a metaphor like, let's imagine we're going on a road trip and you're going east. You tell me you're going east, or I tell you I'm going east. Where is east? And someone might say, well, that's not a destination, that's a direction. That's that's right. So that's kind of like values, right? Like there isn't ever an end point. If kindness matters to you, or, teaching others matters to you, you're probably never going to get to a pinnacle or a summit where you're like, I think I'm done. I think I'm done teaching others. Maybe in one way, if you're like a teacher or a parent, but if there's something that you really care about, that might be something you find yourself doing in other ways, just because it matters to you to be that engaged in the world as a teacher. So inviting people to really think about what those steps, might look like. And so going east, that's the value, but committed action steps are the things that tell you you're on the right track. So in this metaphor, they might be the exits that you see. They are the mile marker numbers that you pass with your driving, which is an action that tells you I'm still going in that right direction. I haven't gotten off an exit. I haven't turned back and gone the other way. When I do these things, or when I cross these thresholds, they remind me, yep, I'm still going east. And another way to think about it, our committed action steps are things that you can check off a list. I did that. And values are things that you embody, that you experience. So they can't readily be checked off a list. So if we think about teaching others, for example, an action step might be, sat with my child today to work on his letters. That's a very clear thing that I may have done. And it helped me embody that idea of teaching. Or kindness. When something I did today to be kind is I held the door open for someone, or I gave someone a compliment. Some of the common challenges that we could watch out for are things like inaction, or avoidance, or even impulsivity. So if people just kind of acting without real clear planning or organization around what they're doing. And that we could probably notice that comes up a lot of different ways in therapy. We invite people to try things, they come in and they say they didn't do it, or they forgot, or they didn't feel like it. And so that's when we might, this one is probably the most obvious of the 6 processes. There's an action that they want to take, it's been identified, and it's just not happening. And maybe on top of that, other things are happening instead. So a disconnection from action or inaction. The process for committed action are probably things that we're actually all really familiar with, is SMART goals. So a lot of the different ACT examples really are around that process of SMART goals that we've all come to learn and find really valuable. And so no matter what activity you find for someone, it probably includes some explanation of SMART goals. The acronym can change a little bit with ACT depending on what book you have, but it's some version of specific. Meaningful, measurable is sometimes one that we use, right? Adaptive, realistic, and time-bound. Something we really want to think about with committed action is that less is more. Like, I want to identify the easiest possible step that someone could take. And if someone gives a really ambitious step, I want to validate that and celebrate that. And then be curious if there's something that's even easier for that to do. Like, I want to make this as easy as possible. I want you to get a W today. I want you to get a win. So what is the easiest win that would help you embody this? And so it might even be helping someone back up a little bit, not because we think they can't do it, but because we want to ensure that they are going to get a sense of accomplishment. And if they want to do more, that's great. And this can also include those conversations that we have around anytime we're talking about goals, which are, thinking about some barriers. What are some things that could get in the way? What are some things that could pull you away from this? So starting to ask about what thoughts might come up that could trip you up or make you feel like you don't want to engage in this? Or what emotions or memories could you get caught up in that might pull you a different way? And how can we help you get back on track so that you can ultimately embody that value that we've identified as really important to you and feels really, really meaningful and reinforcing? And really thinking about what someone is willing to do. So they might have a lot of ideas, but I think it's important to ask, like, are you willing to do this? Like, seems good on paper, seems like it fits with your values. How likely is it to happen? Like, how willing are you to do this? And without judgment, being really open to the answer, because the answer might be, yeah, probably not. Like, it sounds good, but I know myself and it's not going to happen. Great. That's really great information for us to have. So what is something that you might be willing to do? And we might spend a lot of time on that and thinking about willingness and the difference between wanting to do something and being willing to do something. We all spend a lot of time on things we're willing to do that we may not want to do, but we're willing because they are connected with something meaningful. So being able to have that conversation. Another example that is in not just the ACT literature, but other different kinds of recovery literature are stating a public commitment for accountability. So who is one person that you can tell that you're going to do you're going to take this action this week? Or, okay, so is it okay if I ask you about this next week? What happened, how it went, anything that got in the way? So there's a clear connection with, like, this is something I've sort of stated that it's important to me. I've made this connection. I've checked in with my willingness, and now I'm going to have some accountability to help me maybe with that last mile of getting to the end. So many of you probably have a goal worksheet already, and I think anything that you have would work. This is one from an ACT workbook called the Happiness Trap. And you guys might even take this home and think about it for your own values. Or, I guess we could take a couple minutes right now and maybe you take a look at this and you think about that goal that you set, and maybe you imagine breaking it down into these steps. So actually, we've got a little bit of time. I'll just pause for 2 minutes and think about that goal that you wrote down, that step that you wrote down on the values exercise, and really think about either writing it down, or if you don't have anything in front of you, thinking really aloud in your mind, what is the step one? And think about breaking those down into other kinds of goals that you can see in step two. I'll check in with you guys here in just a couple of minutes. Just another minute or so to kind of think through these prompts. So feel free to finish this when we wrap up today. Maybe take a couple minutes and finish the other parts. Something I'll draw your attention to that comes up a lot in ACT literature are something called dead person goals. And that is, and it's not just unique to ACT, but a dead person goal is essentially a goal that a dead person could do better than we could. So something like, I want to have no anxiety. I want to feel no more guilt. I want to be able to control my eating habits 100% of the time. I want to make sure that I don't have any hallucinations. So those are things that a dead person can do more than we can, because you're not able to experience anything in that physical body. So, or in whatever way you think about death, being able to experience it in this sort of life now. And so that can also help a client reframe these really more extreme goals, and really helps facilitate the conversation too around the things that we can control and we can't control. We talked a little about the control agenda last week, and helps open up the conversation around, well, can we really control that you will never have anxiety again, or that you won't have any anxiety this week? Can we really control every single situation that you'll be in so that you will not have anxiety? and really being curious about those answers that someone has. Um, and this can take some time too. It feels kind of obvious, but you could imagine for a specific goal that you have, this could take some time, or what the client might really need some support working through this. This is the ACT case conceptualization that I shared with you a couple of weeks ago, or shared a couple of weeks ago. And as we go through these processes, I'll bring this up every week so we can start to think about how the processes, or each session, I should say, how the processes kind of fit within this case conceptualization. So if you've been imagining a client this whole time, you can start to think about how you might answer these questions in the case conceptualization to really help you formulate that fuller conceptualization if this is a practice that you use. These are, I'll have these up each week too, both references that were used today, but also the links from any of the resources that I gave you, and also just my favorite resources, ones that I have on hand and reread over and over again because they're useful. And so that you can also go and start doing your own digging and gathering resources. We've got some time to spare today, and so I'm here definitely to answer questions or just talk out loud about things that people are thinking about, and happy to do so. So feel free to unmute yourself if that's an option, or drop something in the chat. Awesome. I love when I answer everyone's questions or address everyone's curiosities. Well, hopefully this felt useful for you, and something that you feel like you online. Actually, the only one I was realizing that's not as readily available, the values exercise that you guys did use is something that I created inspired by a different values exercise. I gave you the link to where you can get the original and have the reference there, but I modified it for my practice. But all of the other ones you can get online, and print them off today and use them for a client this afternoon. Well, if you have questions, feel free to let me know. And in a couple of weeks, I can't remember if we're doing being present or opening up next week, but we're talking about 2 more processes next week, or in 2 weeks, and using the same kind of format, introducing the process and then doing an exercise for each of the processes. So you can get a sense of what is an exercise that you might use, and you'll get that experiential practice for yourself, which is really important and is inherent in the ACT training, is that you practice with yourself so that you understand the experiential nature of these activities. You can work through how to introduce them, how to give people space to work through them, and we can really appreciate what we're asking someone to do, because we're asking people, ACT is really about asking people to relate to their experiences in new and different ways, and that is not always easy. And so it's helpful to have an appreciation for that. And also helps us think through how we might introduce something for someone, or understand how it might feel useful. I appreciate all of you all for coming. And again, we've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm here for questions if you've got them. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time. And again, I hope this was useful, and hopefully I can see you again in a couple of weeks.
Thanks, Dr. Wofford. For those that are still around, just wanted to share, we'll be sending out the slides and a link to this recording, as well as the recording from the first session, so that folks will have access to that. As always, if folks have questions for us, feel free to reach out to us at info@southeastmhttc.org. And in particular, if I have a question for Dr. Wofford, email us and we'll get that over to her as well. Again, everyone, thanks so much for joining today, and we will see you all in 2 weeks. Thanks so much. Have a good one.
Thanks, everyone.